Okay. Dr. Jeon, I'll hand it over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Yonga, for introduction. Again, my name is JaeSik Jeon. I go by Jay, so you can call me Jay. So let me start sharing my screen and start my presentation. Okay, so does it look good? Okay. So as Yonga mentioned, my presentation is titled Financial Support, Practical Help, and Residential Choices of the Elderly. So this is basically the study about residential mobility of senior households. I studied a lot about residential mobility of the disadvantaged households back in the United States when I was doing my PhD. I was focused on low-income families back then, and after I came back to Korea, started to have an interest in senior households because in Korea, senior households are also facing difficult situations when it comes to mobility decisions in the market. And Yonga and her team here at Fort Brooks had an opportunity to collaborate with scholars in South Korea. So we're working on this project about aging in place and hope to keep collaborating in the future as well. So this is one of the study that I started to work on based on that project. So let me start. So I kind of wanted to give you some backgrounds of how senior housing is looked like in Korea. So in South Korea, just like any other countries across the world, housing supply for the elderly has not kept pace with aging population. We are having more and more people need housing services or housing units that come with other related social or healthcare services, but that supply is not good enough to cover all those people who need needs. So senior housing development is based in the Welfare of Senior Citizens Act in South Korea. That was first established in 1981. So based on that act, developers can build senior housing units and sell that off to the market. But that act was amended in 2015, which has shifted to permit rental development projects only, not in prohibiting selling units to from individual to individual. So that was because ownership units were illegally sold or leased to ineligible non-elderly households. Those units developed based on this act are only available. It should be only for the seniors, but then management was an issue when it comes to ownership. So even if you're in the senior housing complex, you see some of the families do not eligible for the units, who are the younger people with their kids, started to asking for admitting their children to school while living there. So that kind of issue was severe back then. So that's why one of the reasons the government only allowed to build rental housing only when it comes to senior housing units. And the second issue was this was probably more severe or serious, essential, because community services are important for senior housing development. It's not just about providing housing units to the elderly, but the housing must come with the services that the senior households require. But developers are often better to just sell the units off when they build the housing, when the construction is completed. And after they sell the units off, they don't care as much as they were supposed to be about proper provision of services that they promised to. So when they exited from the project, services provided were inadequate. So that's why the government thought maybe we should permit only rental housing only, so that developers are responsible for providing services constantly, even after completion of the project. And to do that, they think the rental housing only should be necessary. So that's why in the private market, senior housing development is not that profitable. It does not guarantee developers to make good money. So that's why the housing supply hasn't kept pace with the demand. We have in our public sector, we have this organization called Land and Housing Corporation that works like housing associations here in the UK. They are in charge of providing various types of housing units for low-income families, senior households, households with disabilities, all those people with needs. So they do not particularly concern about emerging issues with senior housing units. So the private side must do something as well to serve all those increasing demands in the market. But then because it's not that profitable because of the law limitation, they tend to be targeting higher income or the wealthier senior house only in the private sector. So affordable housing option is definitely in short. So this slide shows that these are examples of senior housing development in South Korea, which are developed and operated by corporations/foundations, hospital or religious organizations, or by private businesses, which are mostly they are wealthier themselves, the foundations, or related to healthcare industries, or just the private business that are looking for a greater cash flow from asking higher rents. So even those players are involved in, still the volume or the stock of the senior housing unit is still in short, and that's the problem. So I think that's the background I wanted to talk about, how that kind of environment have impacts on the residential mobility decisions of the senior households. My argument is that because we don't have many options when it comes to housing for elderlies, so that's why senior households are more likely to depend on their social network, their family members, their friends, or their neighbors to get help regarding household services, healthcare, or rights to somewhere else, things like that. So that's kind of background that my research has. So let's move on to the literature review. So I started with it looking at the just general studies regarding or the theories about the residential mobility. And then I focus on how this mobility can be affected by the social relations and looking at the moving patterns of the elderly people. And one factor I found that is missing in the literature is that intergenerational transfers. So I combine that, I try to fill the gap in the literature with my research. So why do people move? Normally, the residential mobility is a practice that people make, try to minimize or reduce the difference between their optimal set of the desirable housing bundle and the actual bundle they're consuming. So if you're not satisfied with where you are living now, even if that's housing reason or neighborhood reason, you may think about moving to somewhere else. So from that view, it can be a practice of people pursuing optimal equilibrium. On the other hand, mobility is just a life course or life cycle thing. If you graduate from college, you move to places where your first job is located. And when you get married, you move to somewhere else to bigger places or something. When your kids are going to school, you think about neighborhood that have good access to education. So that kind of life course perspective, residential mobility is there as well. And despite all those various backgrounds of mobility decisions, there is one segment here, mobility decisions within the context of social relations. Social relations is informal channels of trust and repeated local interaction, which means we intend or unintentionally use our collective efficacy to accomplish shared goals. So when you are in your neighborhood, you often watch the street to keep the street safe. You want to make sure that there's no crime in your neighborhood. You want to make sure your kids are safe out there. You want to make sure your streets are clean. So that type of efforts that you put it in, even though you're actually, no matter you're actively, involving in all those activities or not, even if you are just an observer, that's still a part of the practice that you do in the context of social relations. So that repeated local social interaction with others or the neighborhood itself creates your collective efficacy of the neighborhood, and that makes social capital, the neighborhood level. So that social capital links to the social networks that you have, and that social networks function as informal channels of trust. So you can depend on your neighbors or people in your network when it comes to, sharing something or asking for something like that. And that also have impacts on the residential mobility decisions. So strong social ties often deter residential mobility. If you are strongly engaged in any activities or things that are going in your neighborhood, you may want to stay even though you feel like your desirable housing bundle is different from what you're actually consuming. So as much as strong social ties you have, you're unlikely to move out of that neighborhood or the network. So that's one argument for the findings from the previous studies. However, it's not always the case. So there are mixed reasons for staying close. One part is the reason that I just mentioned, that if you're close to your neighbors, your family members, or friends in your neighborhood, you feel very emotionally supported, and you sometimes give and receive practical help, household chores, daycare, ride to somewhere else. So that kind of makes you feel connected, and practical help, especially, that functions as a resource for social services that you require. So even though you don't have access to other external social services, you can replace that need, you can replace that access with your social network. So that can be a positive reason, or that makes strong social ties, make stay in your neighborhood. But on the other side, you may feel obligations as you have strong social ties. Even if you don't want to be part of this strong network, sometimes family members require you to take care of other members financially or taking time physically. So that can be a burden on your life. So that type of burdens on household resources function as an obligation. So even if you want to live or get out of it, you still have to be stick with them. That's the downside of the social ties. But even though there are mixed reasons, generally strong social ties often deter residential mobility. And the elderly's moving pattern is not that different. So I looked at some of the literature and on some, included some of them here. First one is theoretical kind of perspective regarding decisions to move of the elderly. So these are the drivers or the factors that concern decisions to move for the elderly. First, triggering mechanism will be there. So types of triggers are many reasons, including life cycle perspective, as I mentioned earlier. And for mobility, there's always a push factor and a pull factor. Push factor are the ones that make you to want to leave your current neighborhood. Pull factor is the one that make you move to that neighborhood. So like just push and pull, just like its name. And one example of push factor is independent laws. So if you are not financially enough to afford your current home, you are involuntarily asked to leave the neighborhood. So that can be one reason. Pull factor is that if there is any other neighborhood where your family members are living in or your friends are living in, they may ask you to, or just casually invite you to moving in there so that they can share their social capital. So that those types of are triggering mechanism factors, and decision influences are affected by personal and external factors. Personal will be your income, your wealth, your health status. Those types of household characteristics have impacts on whether you move or stay. External costs are about the market. So if you are paying higher rents currently, you may think about moving to somewhere else that would allow you to pay lower rent if you are retired or something. That's the two different levels of influences. And when it comes to destination selection, type of move, migration outcomes, it depends on your preference or your choice or your situation. So if you have any experience in some neighborhood, you may like to go there. For example, like hometown, after you go to college or get a job, you lived in the city, then you retire, you may think about going back to your hometown. So that's selection example of your destination. Location of family members or friends are just like pull factors. If there are any neighborhoods where they are living in, you may consider to move there. So as a result of the selection and type of move are determined, you may relocate at the local level, so you don't make long distance move, or you make a long distance move and making this migration far away. So if it's long distance move or short distance move, that can be your type of movement. Migration outcomes are you may live with your family members as a result of the move, or you may live independently, separating from your children if you were together before, and neighborhood is depending on what type, your outcome might be different. So this is kind of moving patterns among the elderly, and that concern about the factors or the drivers of the decisions to move. And if we look at the developmental perspective of the moving patterns, those drivers and factors are reflected in the stages of move, but this particular study kind of generalized the moving patterns of the elderly using 3 stages of the move: first move, second move, and third move. The first move they found is that this is based in what they found in the United States case. So in the United States, there are a couple of retirement communities options that you can choose. So typical migrants would move to retirement communities or to non-metropolitan small town settings if they were from the urban areas. And those migrants who move to these type of housing or areas are likely to be younger, healthier, wealthier, more often to have intact marriages. So these are the findings from the observations or from previous studies. So the poorer retiree, so because wealthier people are more likely to move to retirement communities because it's takes money. So the poorer retirees, on the other hand, often cannot afford to make such a move. So that's the one thing this study find. And while kinship functions can be managed over considerable distances, which means you don't have to get close to your family members, you can still be emotionally attached, even if you live further away. But retirees may move closer to their children or other relatives for the previous reasons that we saw because of the pull factors or because of the personal reasons that cannot afford a home anymore or require some help or something. So this is the reason why the first move, if they move after the retirement, this could be the pattern of the typical move. And second move would be not necessary for everybody, but if you once move to the retirement community or some other places, the pressure for the second move occurs when older people develop chronic disabilities that make it difficult to carry out everyday household tasks. So you move to the retirement community, you are living a good life with your retirement, but then if your health goes bad, it's hard for you to keep living there because you require better health services, or you need to more frequently visit the doctor's offices, or you need some help every day household chore. So if older people live at a distance from their children's home, they need to move toward them when they become disabled or widowed. So that's when the second move occurs. So children, as a child, you produce the internalized commitments necessary for providing household service, which means you will take care of your parents because you're a good kid. So that's when the second move is necessary. Children plays a role as a helper. Former institutions are essential for those older people who are severely disabled so that children cannot take good care of them, or who do not have children they can count on, or whose children are overburdened. So depending on your family matters or situations, sometimes your children cannot help you. In that case, you have to move to nursing homes or something from retirement community. That's when the second move happens. And the third move is very limited, but limited kin source is the motive for the third basing. If you move to your children through your second move and you became severely ill, then you must move away from that neighborhood of the children child help to an institutional setting. So let's say you are lucky that you have this child that help you to live together. but then your health condition got worsened. So now that you don't have any choice to go to the nursing homes and something like that. So that's when this third move happens. So most third stage moves are local rather than long distance moves that this study finds. And this move may not occur for some. Some continue to be cared for by their children until they suddenly die. But this is, again, based in US case. In Korea, we have some different patterns, but not many studies have looked at this kind of developmental perspective of residential mobility of the elderly people. So that made my research to start. And the last part is intergenerational transfers. So in Korea, when you get married, I think it's universal thing across the world. When you get married, your parents are very generous to offer you some help to get housing or something. So it's not always the case, but you received this transfer from your parents that help you to accumulate your wealth because you are able to purchase the home as you get married. And that maybe from the external view of the family, that maybe help the family to continue their income status or the wealth status so that they can keep prospering, I guess. So the intergenerational transfers usually is from parents to children. It helps families to accumulate wealth and capital and distribution of income intergenerationally. And on the other side, if children can help their parents financially, that way consumption of those retired senior households can be improved. The consumption level itself. Consumption smoothing, I would say, is that perspective. So there are important roles that intergenerational transfers play in these perspectives. And motives for transfers that this study found comes from two different, probably contradicting hypotheses. The first is altruism hypothesis, which means transfers are made out of a donor's concern for the well-being of the recipient. So parents and children help each other unconditionally because they care about each other. So that's one hypothesis about or the motive behind these intergenerational transfers. But the other hypothesis is the exchange hypothesis, which means monetary transfers are made in lieu of payments or services received. So let's go back to the example that parents helping children when they get married. So if you get married, you receive the help from your parents when you purchase the house. So that helps you to accumulate your wealth, and that should be good for all of your family members. And then years later, your parents got sick and they need help, or they got retired. So they wanted somebody from the family can take care of them, even though it's not that severe needs or something. So at that point, parents may think about, I helped this child that much. That, on the other hand, this child, I didn't really help him out. So that's kind of exchange happens. And child themselves as well, children, they tend to be kind of obligated to do something because they definitely received something from their parents. So that type of exchange responsibility comes from these intergenerational transfers. So this study finds that money and time transfers by parents are positively correlated with time transfers by children. So you have to keep in mind that parents are giving money and time, whereas children are spending their time as a transfer. So, which means parents spend money on their children, they help with financially, and then as an exchange, children may spare their time to help their parents or something. So this exchange hypothesis is there as well. And I think given the context of the social relations of the mobility, this exchange hypothesis of intergenerational transfer might have huge impact on the decisions of the elderly. But no studies so far have looked at the relationship between the social relations or social capital and this intergenerational transfers. So I decided to look at it. Little is known about whether financial transfers or practical help from their social network affect the elderly's decisions to move. So here are my hypotheses or my research idea is that if a parent receives enough help from their child, they may be more likely to continue living in their current residence so that they can stay. But this practical assistance may only be provided according to that motive of the intergenerational transfers in exchange for a financial transfer from the parent to the child. In addition, if there is a financial transfer from the parent to children, the child may provide financial support in lieu of practical assistance. Although in the literature, it's positively related with time transfer only. But when I see people around me in Korea, some folks are unable to just take time to take care of their parents. So instead of that, they send some money to hire someone who can do that on behalf of them. So in that sense, I believe the child may provide financial transfer in lieu of practical help. That may also facilitate residential move to a nursing home or just with that help, they can just stay at home. So there are mixed results according to this hypothesis, but that's kind of research motive I have. And similarly, children's receipt of practical assistance from their parents, such as childcare, may also facilitate or impede residential mobility for older adults. Children are not the only one who receive practical help, who provide practical help. Parents can be the help giver as well. So when you're retired, now that you have a grandson and your son and daughter-in-law, they're both working. So somebody has to take care of the grandson. And because now that you're retired, you may take more time to do that, even though they are hiring someone or they are sending the kid to the daycare or something. So in many cases, I see that grandparents are looking out for their grandson. And for that reason, some young folks prefer to live closer to their parents to get this type of help. So I believe because of those reasons, there are some dynamics about financial transfers and practical help, and those two dynamics and their relationships both have impacts on the residential mobility of the elderly. So throughout this study, I wanted to kind of address that question. So here are my research questions. How does the mobility pattern of the elderly by proximity to children? How does the mobility pattern vary by proximity to children? How do practical help and financial transfers affect the probability of moving? How does the effect vary by the relationship between children. And to do that, I use this data set called Korean longitudinal study of aging. This survey subjects are middle or old age population nationwide, Korea, and the survey is conducted every 2 years. So using that panel data set, I focus on the specific group to look at the particular, to address my research question. So I focused on this specific household who are 60 years or older and have one or more children, so that I can look at the relationship between parents and children. And I limited my sample to parents that don't live with children. And I used the information from the surveys to determine whether parents moved or not. But that information is somewhat limited. So I only looked at households who moved to other provinces, which might be a long distance move as movers. So the moves within the neighborhood are dropped because of the data limitations. So in my study, the probability of mobility might be underestimated for that reason. And I tried this and that when it comes to mobility study, but residential mobility of the elderly is generally very not often compared to other just regular households because of their age, I believe. So first I wanted to take a look at who make the move and who makes the second move, that type of series of the mobility thing. But it turns out that not many people, and plus because data limitation, it was hard to build that type of model. So I only looked at the first move this time, and I ran the sample logic model where if they using the information, whether they moved or not, I try to look at how household characteristics and the key variables I have, practical help and financial transfers, have impact on probability of moving. So age, male, married, severely ill, retired, those are the demographics of the household. Apartment, if they are moving, if they lived in apartment or not, location, if they lived in urban areas or not, also have impact on the mobility. So I include that. Wealth is one factor as a personal factor that concern about decisions to move. So I include that. And two variables, key variables, practical help and financial support. I estimate a standardized score, and I measured practical help from children to parents, plus practical help from parents to children, and financial support as well. I measured that from children to parents and from parents to children. So those four variables are key variables that I have. I also added distance to the nearest child to control whether they move toward children or move away from children. But I think I should think more clearly about whether I should include that variable or not, which doesn't quite have impact on the results of the other variables. So here's how I came up with my standardized score. I used item response theory estimation, using basically the survey questions to compute score of the extent of practical help from children to parents and extent of practical help from parents to children. So the higher the score, the greater the dependence. And here are the results. Residential mobility tree, there were total 3,463 households in my sample. 5% elderly people moved, whereas 95% stayed. And again, this might be due to the data limitation. So the moved household might be higher than this. But when I looked at how they make the move, depending on the distance between parents and children, 56%, there were basically no difference between distance to their nearest child before and after the move. So the most of them didn't make a long distance move according to this result, whereas the others, 15% actually are presumably make the long distance move. And here's the results of the logic regression. Not all the variables turned out to be significant, but if you look at the four major key variables, practical help from children to parents here in the middle turns out to be negative and significant. So I'll try to summarize what I have found. Senior households living in an apartment unit in urban areas are more likely to move, which is an average residential mobility pattern for urban residents. It's not necessarily for the senior household, but senior households with a severe ill health condition are more likely to move. So I found positive and significant results on this one, which is consistent with the previous finding, although it was for the second move. The second move, if you recall it, they first moved to the retirement community, and if their health conditions going bad, they move closer to the children. Because in Korea, we don't have many options of retirement communities. They live somewhere else they were originally lived in. And then if their health conditions got worse, and they probably make a move. So that's the pattern I found here. And wealthier households are less likely to move, which is inconsistent with the previous finding that wealthier people are more likely to move to the retirement community. But again, because we don't have many options of senior housing, so that's why wealthier people, rather than moving, they are likely to stay. So I pinpoint that this is probably due to the lack of senior housing options in Korea. And senior households who receive more practical help from children are less likely to move. This is the key finding, I believe, which is consistent with the previous finding that children are willing to provide help for their parents when it comes to related to their residential mobility. I expected the financial support turns out to be impactful, and there were I assume some kind of dynamics between these variables, but my model itself doesn't really consider dynamics between financial transfers and practical help. That's one limitation as well. But in this current setting, financial support results were insignificant. So financial support from children to parents may be linked to the probability of moving to a nursing home, because we don't have retirement community. We thought maybe it is linked to the moving to a nursing home, but we couldn't really tease that out. So that's another limitation. But financial support from parents to children may be associated with independent loss, because they already spend money on children is getting a home. So that have impacted on the wealth level of those parents' household. But at the same time, you get a help from children as an exchange. You're helping. So there's kind of contradicting mixed reasons. So maybe that have impacted on this insignificant results. That's another interpretation, but needs more work there. So this is not completed project. I'm still working on revising the models. So I'm currently thinking about add more data. Data from 2020 now becomes available. So if I add that, the results might change. And I should think more clearly about policy implications given the conditions of the senior housing in Korea, and how that have implications on housing development or other senior policies. So that's everything I have here today. So I'll be happy to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeon. I think that is really interesting, research, particularly using unique data set. So I think this is the time for any question from audience. Is there any question? Yeah. Sorry, outside my office, there are very loud noise, if you can hear probably, so apologies.
Yes.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Jay, thank you for your account of your research, which sounds really interesting. I'm particularly interested, I suppose, in the things you were talking about at the end about parallels with the United Kingdom. And I think the first thing I would draw attention to is there's almost a missing generation in your analysis, because if I was looking at this in a UK context, I would be looking at a generation above the people that you've been describing. So, because classically people in their 60s and 70s even are less likely to be making moves into institutional care or residential moves or that sort of thing. They're much more likely themselves to be carers, both upwards and downwards. So that's a classic sandwich generation of carers who are looking after grandchildren and providing care for very elderly parents in their 80s and 90s. So there's somehow that whole sort of, I think the intergenerational transfer and so on is much more layered and complex than might be the case in Korea. I don't know, but certainly there's another level, I think, to bring into that equation. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. So I totally agree with you that the 60s are probably not the age group that may consider moving to nursing home or something. As you said, they're kind of in the middle of the policy-wise as well. They're kind of excluded from, but they can be active. So maybe that's the reason as well. But when I first look at the data set, I was originally wanting to look at those older generations, but then because not many people make move at that age, and the move that make at their age are more likely to be moving to a nursing home or any other institutional facilities. So I kind of wanted to address broader kind of range of mobility patterns. So to do that, I think I should look at broader range of age groups and maybe run the subgroup submodels or something when run the analysis. So I think your comment is really helpful to think more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other comments or any question related to this talk? Yes, Joe?
Right. So just related to that, I was just thinking that actually in this country, our retirement age is I mean, it's 68, potentially going up even higher than that. And so I think in Korea, your retirement age is a lot lower, isn't it, as well? So I'm guessing people would be more likely to move when after they've retired. So, yeah.
Right. So retirement age in Korea is usually 60. And for university professors, we're 65. So I guess I'm lucky in that perspective. So that's why I first look at 65 or older generation who are already retired or who just got retired. But again, because of the sample size, the data limitation, I try to expand the sample over 60 so that I can cover new retirees or age that are near to the retirement. Yeah, so that I guess that's not that different from UK and Korea.
I think also it's going to be really interesting that comparison between the UK and South Korea because of cultural difference. Because I think in the UK we don't look after our elderly so much. It's I know in South Korea you're very good at looking after your older parents, and I think in this country we've lost that, and quite often the older generation live a long way away from their children. So it's a really interesting comparison, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think in Korea that when it comes to intergenerational transfers, this exchange hypothesis works very strongly in our culture, I think. But in other countries, just like the paper I cited, they also find a stronger effect of based in the altruism hypothesis. They just help each other unconditionally, whereas in my country, when I give you help, you pay me back with something else. So that's strong in our culture, and comparing that with other country, which is not the case, I think we can find something interesting there.
Is there anything additional comment? Then can I actually add some comment? So when I heard about this the paper, I was so interested in, because the data Korean longitudinal data provide is quite amazing, because when I look at comparatively, when I look at ELSA data, English longitudinal data, there is no variable, equivalent variable, for example, practical help and financial transfer kind of things. So I think if you develop this as it is, as a quantitative analysis, that will add the good contribution to literature in this kind of area first. But I also know that because of the small proportion of movement of senior people, it actually, even though you include 60 plus, is only 5%, but it is difficult to go up to 70 or 80. So I think inherently that the nature of this study is maybe very limited to look at the behind, motivation of mobility things. So you may combine with more qualitative interview and things. So that actually bring interesting and then more detailed understanding of why they move kind of things. So that is my one comment. But I think this study is, because of the uniqueness of data, definitely is a contributor to literature. But I think we can probably discuss together and then how we can do very equivalent kind of study in between South Korea and UK is very much have a potential to develop together in collaboration. So I think thank you so much. Is there any other comment to make? Yes, Ji-hwan, yes.
Could you talk? Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, we are in the same room, so. Yeah, I'm just interested in one of the key variables, as I thought, like the practical help. So possibly we can assume that there's maybe no count about how many times a week there can be kind of practical help each other. So for instance, if you can define kind of the threshold distance, right? Or more the frequent visit or not, at least in the same neighborhood, or I mean the same municipal level. So I just want curious if you make kind of some interaction terms between the distance and the such dummy variable practical how, then you may make more stories from such interaction terms. So that is my suggestion. I'm not sure. So also one of my curiosity is also kind of the practical help and the financial support are mutually exclusive, or sometimes they're some kind of the combination. So I think that definitely you may that is very simple, right? You can check there is some kind of the relations between the support each other should be mutually exclusive or not, and maybe you can derive more stories about the check the such relations. I think, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for your comment. That's what's missing in my current model. That I don't have any variables that look dynamics. I keep talking about dynamics of practical help and financial support, but I don't have any variable to control that or have the effect of those interactions. So I should come up with some better ideas, and your suggestions are very helpful to make me do that. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I think thank you very much, Dr. Jeon, and thank you for this very interesting and inspiring research. I hope we can have another time to, hear about how the paper actually research is developed. So looking forward to hear, another chance, maybe. Okay.
I'll keep in touch.
Thank you very much. Then thank you for joining this seminar. Thank you for everybody. And then I will close this session. Thank you.